GM Tips, Episode 3, Combat! Why have I got a wooden sword? So combat in the One Ring is very narrative driven. It's not as crunchy as some games, but it is the crunchiest of the three subsystems in the One Ring role-playing game. There's quite a lot to get through in this video, so I'm going to talk about the basics of combat and get into the kind of the pre-combat stuff that you have to go through, and then into combat rounds, the anatomy of a combat round, and then lastly I'll get into some of the crunch, so some of the sort of technicalities and more interesting things that you can spice combat up with. I'm not going to talk about mass combat in this video because I think that is not covered in the rules at all, and it doesn't really work with the standard combat rules, so it's something you kind of need to homebrew or look elsewhere for some inspiration on. I'll cover that in a separate video though. I've run a couple of mass combat sessions and they've gone okay. Certainly the most recent one went quite well, so I'll definitely cover that. But for this video we're going to focus on just normal, straight out of the box combat, and let's have a look. So the first thing to cover really is the pre-combat procedures or processes that you have to go through. There's like a 4-step checklist. I've got them up on my screen, so I'm going to be kind of looking away quite a lot because there's quite a lot of sort of rules and crunch to work through on this. So firstly, the lore master or the GM works out whether there's some kind of ambush going on in this scene. So are your characters trying to ambush the enemy, or are they being ambushed themselves? That determines what kind of rolls your PCs make for the surprise test, which is the first step in the pre-combat process. Surprise tests are based on either awareness, hunting, or battle. If the characters are the ones being ambushed, and if they are the ones trying to ambush, then they can roll stealth, hunting, or battle. And the GM and the group of players kind of work out which is most appropriate for that situation. So it depends on what the scene is. If they are being ambushed, then all of the heroes need to pass their surprise tests. If they fail their surprise tests, they're going to lose their opening volleys and bonus success dice. Yeah. So combat, as with all of the three subsystems in the One Ring, begins, once you've got past this bit, with bonus rolling for your bonus dice. So you, if you're journeying, you make a travel roll. If you're having an interaction, an encounter with a NPC, you make an insight roll. In combat, you roll battle. Whether you are ambushed or not determines whether you get to make a roll for your bonus success dice. If a hero succeeds at his surprise test with a great or extraordinary success, that is, they roll they beat the target number, which is usually 14, and they also get a tengwa, a 6, on one of the 6-sided dice. That's a great success. If they get 2 or more tengwas, that's an extraordinary success. On a great success, they get to alert a friendly ally or hero. So if, let's say, you've got a party of 3, 2 of them fail the surprise test, and one of them passes the surprise test with a extraordinary success, he can or she can alert 2 other heroes or allies, meaning that they bypass that and they pass their surprise test. You can see what I mean about the complexity of combat. Already it's a little bit crunchy. Okay, so once you've done your surprise test, you then determine the initiative. And the outcome of initiative depends on the scene itself and whether the heroes as a group kind of passed their surprise tests. So there's a number of different outcomes, and if the company is defending against an advancing enemy, they have the initiative. I think overall initiative is kind of weighted towards the heroes, really. Probably for good reason. You know, you want them to be at the heart of it. There's a table in the core book which is very good, and and the core book kind of covers initiative and who gets initiative depending on the various outcomes. The other thing that's quite good is the GM screen has some pretty nifty tables. These tables are very useful, so I recommend that if you're into your tables. Once you've determined initiative, you then go into the third step in the pre-combat procedure, which is combat advantages, and that's when the heroes will roll battle for bonus success dice. This is just a standard roll, usually target number 14, and unless it's a particularly difficult situation, and they're going to roll battle, and for every, if they get a normal success, they will get 1 bonus success dice for use during the combat. If they make a great success, they get 2. If it's extraordinary, they get 3. And these are just kind of floating dice that basically sit in front of each hero, so they've got them and they can use them during combat at any stage, but they must declare that they're using it before they make the roll. Also, any other player may use another player's bonus success dice before they make a roll with the agreement of that player. Step 4 of the pre-combat process is resolve opening volleys. So any characters who have a ranged weapon, and that includes spears, may, with the GM's kind of say so, may make opening volleys. Usually only 1 opening volley. Sometimes 2 if there's a lot of ground to cover before you meet close combat. And that is a target number 12 roll plus the opponent's parry. The opposing enemies also get to make a opening volley or 2 if there's a lot of distance. So don't forget to do that, GMs. You've got a role to play here as well. And don't make it a walk in the park for your players. Once you've resolved opening volleys, you then go into close quarters combat. The steps in a combat round are very simple, with some added complexities, of course. So the steps in the combat round are: 1, choose your stance. And there are 4 different stances, all covered in the core rulebook. Very good way of kind of thinking slightly abstractly about formation of the party and location and what they're doing. It takes a little bit of explaining at first for a new group of players about stances and what they signify. The thing to keep in mind as a GM really is that you don't want your players to get too hung up on where they're positioned on a map or something like that. You want to be very descriptive when you set up a combat scene. So try to think about stances in terms of broadly what the character is doing, what they're trying to achieve, the position they're taking in battle rather than their position on a map. So the stances are forward stance, which is very aggressive, offensive. Open stance, which is kind of trying to be a bit free and easy and taking the battle as it comes. Defensive, and rearward stance, which is the stance that ranged characters will want to assume. And characters in rearward stance can only be targeted by ranged weapons. So once the heroes have assumed their stances, they have target numbers assigned to each stance, which will be the target numbers for their attacks and will also be the target numbers for enemies who are trying to attack them. So something that is incredibly useful in combat is Void State's sheet, which tracks the position, or the stance, sorry, of each hero, and has the target number for each stance, but also has little slots here for the widths of each character. So where you've got a hero in both, let's say both heroes are in open stance, one's got widths of 3 and the other one's got widths of 6. That one with the widths of 6 is going to act first in a combat round. So this is quite useful. And the other thing that Void State's put here is little Eye of Saurons, and they are handy to record if the character, or if the player, sorry, rolls an Eye of Sauron during their attack, because that has an effect which I'll talk about later. So yeah, really good little sheet, and I think he did the travel sheet as well, which goes with it, so you can print both of those double-sided, and then you've got your little sheet for combat and travel. So yeah, stances, assume your stance, and rearward stance, very important to get into a little bit of the crunch around rearward stance. So a hero can only assume rearward stance if at least 2 other characters are in a close combat stance, so forward, open, or defensive, and the total number of enemies is not more than twice the number of heroes. So rearward can kind of, for ranged characters, it can be a little bit of a crutch. Like, it's just, yep, I'm in rearward, I'm hiding, I'm going to shoot from the back, no one can touch me, because they can't be engaged. So it's important for the GM to keep track of the rules around rearward and make sure that actually they can assume a rearward stance. So you can't have, let's say, 1 hero in a forward stance and then 3 heroes in rearward, unengageable. That just can't happen. You've got to have 2 other heroes per hero in rearward. So for a party of 3, only one of those can be in rearward. You can never have 2 in a party of 3 in rearward stance. And then if there's a huge number of enemies and they're outnumbered by more than twice, then they cannot assume rearward. So that can be quite a handy kind of tool for a GM if you've got a character who just turtles and hides in rearward and shoots arrows at your beautifully crafted creatures. Once the heroes have taken their stances, you then into engagement, and this is where the enemies pair off with heroes, or the heroes choose which enemies they're going to pair off with, and that depends whether the heroes are outnumbered or whether they outnumber the enemies. So if there are more enemies than heroes, then the GM is going to pair each unengaged enemy with a hero, and then any remaining enemies can then engage heroes that are already engaged. If there are more heroes than enemies, the players decide who they're engaging, and they can engage one or more heroes can engage a single enemy. There are rules around how many enemies can engage a single hero and how many heroes can engage a single enemy, and that depends on whether it's a normal human-sized enemy or a big enemy like a troll. So a hero can be engaged by 3 orcs or goblins or, human-sized enemies, or 2 large enemies. 2 trolls. That's quite a nice idea. And enemies can be engaged by up to 3 heroes, or 5 heroes in the case of trolls. So we've done stance, we've done engagement. The third part of a combat round is player turns. And if the company has the initiative, they are going to take their turns first. If the enemy has the initiative, they're going to take their turns first and attack engaged enemies in the order of your choice. As the GM, you get to choose the order. And also any enemies that are not engaged with heroes can do things from a ranged position and use ranged weapons and things like that. So the player turns, they're probably going to use their lovely weapons to attack your creatures, and they do that by rolling the relevant skill. If they're using a sword, they roll their sword skill. If they're using an axe, they do that. And the target number is set by the stance that they took. So if they're in a forward stance, it's 6. Target number 6 plus the enemy's parry rating, which is variable. And they want to meet or beat that target number. And if they do that, they will deal damage equal to the weapon's damage rating. If they get a great success, they're going to deal damage equal to the weapon's damage rating plus that hero's damage bonus, which is based on their body attribute. If they get an extraordinary success, it deals the weapon's damage rating plus double the hero's damage rating. Additionally, if the player rolls on the feat die a number equal to or higher than the weapon's edge rating, they have possibly inflicted an injury, a wound, on that enemy. And so edge rating is different for every weapon, and you can kind of reduce it in the fellowship phase with various undertakings. So you can kind of upgrade your weapons, and that's one of the ways you can upgrade them. So if a player rolls equal to or higher than the edge rating, they then the enemy needs to make a protection test to see whether they were wounded or whether their armor protected them. So protection test is different for every enemy and every hero, depending on the armor they've got, the armor they're wearing. Chainmail shirt, let's say, gives you 3d6 of protection. And you get to roll the feat die because you always get to roll the feat die. A helm will give you +1 to that roll. I think maybe there's a +2 helm as well. So let's say we've just rolled higher than our edge rating with an axe, attacking a orc, and it now needs to make a protection test. It's wearing a chainmail shirt and a helm, so it's going to roll 3d6 and the feat die, and it gets +1 to that roll. it needs to roll equal to or higher than the original weapon's injury rating, which is the target number for the saving throw eventually. If it makes that test, if it succeeds, then it's not injured, but it still gets the damage that it would have from the attack anyway. If it fails, it's going to be wounded. Now, if it's a hero who's wounded, they check the wound box on their character sheet. That's all that happens, really. Nothing else happens unless they were already wounded. I'll talk about damage in a moment. If an enemy is wounded, that's it. It's out of the game. It's dead. So if it's reduced to 0 endurance points, usually it's dead, unless it's a troll. If it's wounded, it's dead. Yeah, so in essence, that's how an attack works. You make the roll, you hopefully succeed in meeting the target number. You deal damage, depending on whether you got a success, a great success, or an ordinary success, and then you look at whether you also met the edge rating of the weapon and scored a critical hit, and then the enemy gets to make a saving throw against that. Core rulebook has quite a lot of info on states of health on page 128 and 129. It's worth familiarizing yourself with those because that's pretty crunchy. Essentially, endurance points signify the character's health. Additionally, they can be wounded, and they can also become weary. And then if they've spent hope and gained shadow, they can become miserable as well. They can be knocked unconscious, and they can go into a state of dying. And if they're in that kind of state, then they can be killed. So you lose endurance, you take some hits, and your endurance starts to go down. If it reaches your fatigue level, which is defined by your the encumbrance of the kit that you're wearing, and then any fatigue tests you might have failed. As soon as your endurance meets your fatigue, you become weary. And when you're weary, 1s, 2s, and 3s on 6-sided dice don't count in your rolls. And keep in mind that when you are on the path to being reduced to 0 endurance, you're probably going to become weary as well. So the combat is going to start to become harder from that moment on. So I guess as a GM, it's about striking that balance in your combat scenarios, in your combat scenes, of knowing that, okay, once characters are kind of becoming weary or are wounded, now they're a bit more fragile. It's quite easy for things to snowball. And yeah, just kind of keep that in mind when you're running combat scenes, and make sure it fits in with the tone of your campaign. And that if you're geared up for a total party kill, then great. If you want to let them off the hook slightly, then you might want to think about how you factor that in. Okay, so that's damage. The other thing to talk about is called shots. And called shots are kind of an opportunity for the players to showboat a little bit. So as they progress, as they get more advancement points, they're bound to invest some of those advancement points into their weapon abilities, the weapon skills, and they're going to get better and better at using their weapons. So if they're rolling 4 or 5 dice, they're easily going to meet the target number more often than not. And the game could become quite boring, or combat could become quite boring at that stage if it were not for called shots. So called shots are things like a piercing blow, or disarming your opponent, or smashing their shield, There's a load of them in the Adventurer's Companion, which is another product that I highly recommend for kind of expanding and making combat more complete in your game. In order to achieve a called shot, the player, before they declare their attack, they must announce that they're making a called shot, and they're different for each weapon. So they declare the called shot, they declare the target, and then they make the roll. And they've got to succeed at the target number, but also roll a 6, a tengwa, on one of their dice. And achieving the called shot will have the specific effect of that weapon's called shot. And failing means that it just whiffs, it doesn't hit at all. So there's a kind of push your luck element to it, and it's a good mechanic. It definitely works well when players are rolling 4 or 5 dice for their attacks. If they fail the called shot, actually, even if they succeed the called shot and they roll a Eye of Sauron, that triggers, or will trigger, a GM character called shot in return. So on the GM's turn, on the enemy's turn to attack, they will attempt a called shot. So the GM doesn't get to decide when you're going to make called shots for your enemies. That's determined by the players attempting called shots and rolling Eye of Sauron on their roll. Yeah, called shots. They're good. A good thing. I wonder, is there anything else? I've probably missed stuff, because there's so much around combat. If there's something that I haven't covered that you think is worth mentioning, please shout it out in the comments, because I'm sure I've missed something. Like I said, combat is definitely the crunchiest subsystem in the game, with good reason, and it takes a bit of getting used to. Something that's really useful that I recommend, along with void states sheets, is the Adventurer's Companion has a really good set of tables at the back, including it's kind of a reference guide to combat, and it breaks it down really well into the steps. It's geared up for heroes rather than GMs, but it's a very good resource. Really worth familiarizing yourself with this and making sure that you know the subsystem as well as you can. You'll still forget things, you'll still miss little triggers and stuff, but if you get to know it before you start throwing combat scenes into your sessions, then things will flow a bit and combat won't seem as much of a grind as it can be when it sort of just gets repetitive and people are just saying, "Oh, I'm going to use my axe," and they're chucking dice. Something that the core book really emphasizes is having a narrative approach to combat, and that applies to the players as well. So encourage them to describe what they're doing and to sort of live and breathe their characters a little bit, rather than just take a very mechanical approach to it and talk about numbers and how many dice they get and things like that. The second thing I'd say for GMs that's really important to know is your enemies. So make use of their abilities, make use of their hate points. So hate is your resource as a GM. That's your currency for combat. If you're not using it, if you're just treating the orcs and the spiders as just dice rolling abstracts, then you're missing a trick, because they've got some really good abilities. That some of them are brutal. I mean, no quarter, for example, is just horrific. Great leap. So wolves have got great leap, and that can just ruin a ranged character's day. Have a look at your enemies. Have a look at just the list of enemy abilities in the core book, and just choose stuff that's gonna make your heroes scratch their heads and work out how do we defeat these things. It's quite easy for combat against a big troll or something to just become a slugfest, but actually once you get beneath the hood and you start looking at how enemy abilities factor in and how that hate score can be utilized against the heroes, it turns into a puzzle for the heroes in actually finding ways around the problem and trying to defeat the enemy. So a troll who's got thick hide, I think it is, or something like that, cannot be killed by an endurance loss. So you can reduce its endurance to 0. Doesn't matter. It's still swinging at you. It's still coming. You've got to wound it. So that just makes the heroes think, okay, well, how do we do that? Have we got any abilities? Have we got, have we upgraded weapons to allow us to re-roll the feat die or something, and just dig a little bit deeper and make combat a bit more interesting and a bit more impactful. I think that's about it. There's quite a lot to get through. If you made it through to the end, thanks for sticking it out. And thanks for your comments and likes. It's really useful to get some feedback from viewers and know that people are finding this useful. So, keep telling me what you want to see, what kind of stuff you need help with, and I'll try and help. I wouldn't say I'm an expert at this game, but we had session number 14 this week of our campaign, and we've done a lot of combat, we've done a fair amount of exploring. There's quite a lot I'd like to cover in the future. I know someone was asking about magic. We've only just started to kind of talk about magical items and treasure, and whether we start to factor those into our games. There was a really good question about kind of preparing as a GM and organizing stuff. I've got some really good advice on that from an organizational sort of point of view, because you can end up with a ton of notes and notebooks and scribbles and rules that you need to look up, and little bookmarks hanging out of the place. And actually there is a way that you can just keep it all in one place digitally and look everything up really quickly. So I'll definitely share that with you guys in a later video, and I'd like to cover mass combat in another video as well. But anything else, just let me know. I'll certainly try and help if I can. And thanks for watching. Wow, that was a lot to get through.